Welcome to Who Yelling Now, Season 4, Episode 9, titled When Truth Can No Longer Stop Harm. Copyright Mackenzie. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge something that many of us may not say out loud. We are tired. Not the tired that comes from work or sleep. A different kind of tired. The kind that settles in the mind. Because every day there is something new to know. Something new to react to. Something new to feel outraged about. Something new to defend. Something new to explain. We scroll. We listen. We read. We argue. We defend. We correct. We repost. And somewhere in that endless movement of information, something quiet begins to happen. Not ignorance, not denial, exhaustion. Truth does not arrive gently anymore. It arrives in waves, war reports, economic collapse, political accusations, casualty numbers, video clips, expert opinions, counter-expert opinions, breaking news, updated breaking news, corrected breaking news. Eventually, the mind does something very human. It protects itself, not by rejecting truth, but by lowering its emotional volume. Because if every tragedy demands the full weight of our grief, we would not survive the day. So, we adapt. We hear numbers now where once we heard names. We hear statistics where once we imagined faces. And slowly, quietly, truth begins to lose its ability to interrupt us. Not because it disappeared, but because we can no longer carry it. My fellow yellers, here's a poem I call Exhaustion. Truth once knocked like a visitor at the door. Now it floods the hallway before we can stand. 1,000 voices speaking at once. 1,000 tragedies asking for space in the same room, and the mind, poor, fragile thing, does what it must. It dims the light. It lowers the volume. It files the grief under numbers. Truth did not grow weaker. We grew tired. Let me tell you a story. It's called Battle of the News Media. A large family gathered together one evening. A proud family. A patriotic family. The kind of family where service to country was not just history, it was tradition. The father had served, the mother had served. Several sons and daughters had worn the uniforms. Cousins, aunts, uncles. Decorations on the wall, photographs in frames, stories of deployments and homecomings. This was not a family that questioned the idea of defending their country. They believed in it deeply, fiercely, and because they believed in it so strongly, certain facts had a difficult time entering the room. It was a family gathering, so the house was full. Veterans, spouses, friends, in-laws, people who had never served, people who had. Food on the table, children laughing somewhere down the hall. Someone turned on the television just to catch the news. The channel was one I'll call Your Way. The newscaster spoke confidently. Our forces continue to make strong progress in the region. Low casualty numbers were reported, strategic victories highlighted. Maps appear showing steady advances. The reason for the war were repeated with clarity and certainty. Around the room, heads nodded. That made sense. That felt right. That matched what many in the room believed. But not everyone. Someone quietly said, "Try the other station." The channel changed. Now the broadcast came from what we'll call Their Way channel. This newscaster's tone was different. The screen showed destroyed cities, thousands of casualties, refugees walking long roads, international leaders arguing across conference tables. The reasons for the wars were repeated with clarity and certainty. Around the room, heads nodded. That made sense. That felt right. That matched what many in the room believed. But not everyone. So the debate continued. The voices grew louder. One person insists the images were selective. Another insisted the first station had hidden the truth. Someone said, "They're lying to you." Someone else replied, "No, you're the one being lied to." The discussion became heated. Not because these people hated one another, but because they loved something deeply, their country. And when love and fear sit in the same room, voices tend to rise. Finally, an elder in the family stood up. Without a word, he walked over. He turned the television off. The room went quiet. Then he walked to the radio. He turned it on. Music filled the room. Who argues with music? The tension softened. People laughed again. Someone started singing. Someone else started dancing in the kitchen. Food was passed around. Plates refilled. The room became warm again. For a while, the war disappeared. Until the song ended. And the radio announcer spoke. This next song is dedicated to the fallen soldiers whose bodies return home today. And just like that, the war was back in the room. Not as numbers, not as strategies, but as bodies, real ones, coming home. And for a moment, no one spoke. That night, the room grew quiet again. Not because the war had ended, not because the truth had been settled, but because everyone in the room realized something uncomfortable. None of them were hearing the war the same way. One channel gave them certainty, another gave them devastation, and somewhere between those two versions lived something far more fragile: truth itself. The strange thing is, this realization is not new. Human beings have been warning each other about this moment for centuries. Different languages, different nations, different wars, but the same concern. Again and again, voices rose throughout history trying to warn us about fear, about power, about war, about the human condition. Voices that spoke clearly, voices that hoped we would listen. And yet, here we are. So, today, I want to remember some of those voices, not word for word, but in spirit. Because sometimes the warning of the past sound less like history and more like prophecy. So here is a poem I wrote just for my forefathers. I call it Great Lines from Our Forefathers. They warned us long before our headlines, long before our broadcast, long before our endless scrolling screens. They warned us. One voice stood before a frightened nation and said, "There is nothing to fear but fear itself." Not the enemy, not the storm, fear itself. Because fear makes the mind small, and small minds accept large lies. Another voice whispered from a prison cell, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." A quiet sentence, but dangerous, because it refuses to let suffering stay local. Others spoke of evil, not as monsters in distant lands, but as ordinary silence. Evil triumphs when good people do nothing. A warning so simple it almost sounds polite. But history proved otherwise. Some warned us about war. They told us that the first casualty is truth. Not soldiers, not cities, truth. Because once truth falls, everything else can be justified. And some voices warned us about ourselves. They reminded us that all the world is a stage, not only for kings and actors, but for citizens, for witnesses, for anyone deciding whether to speak or remain comfortably silent. These were not mysterious prophets. They were people, everyday people. People who had seen enough to understand something terrifying. The human condition does not collapse suddenly. It erodes slowly. One fear, one lie, one silent moment at a time. And still, they spoke. Across centuries, across wars, across revolutions, hoping that someday their warning would arrive before the damage. But history has a cruel habit. It remembers the lines after the lesson. You see, my dearest listeners, truth has been in the room the whole time. On one channel, on the other channel, in the music, in the silence. But something had changed. No one knew which truth to carry. So for a moment, they carried none. Truth does not always disappear when harm continues. Sometimes truth is present, documented, broadcast, recorded, but the human mind, overwhelmed by its weight, quietly steps aside. Not because we are evil, but because we do not care. But because the mind can only hold so much grief before it protects itself. And when that happens, harm no longer needs secrecy. It simply continues. It's the difference between mourning the death of a family member and the death of 1,000 neighbors. Here's a poem I call The Exhausted Truth. Truth doesn't always die in the darkness. Sometimes it dies in daylight. Archived, shared, documented, broadcast. But too many times, too many screams, too many warnings, too many voices saying this cannot continue, and still it does. Because the human mind is not built to carry the grief of 1,000 strangers. So truth arrives and finds the room already full of yesterday's outrage, full of last week's tragedy, full of numbers we promised ourselves we would never forget, until we did. Truth does not have to be buried. It only has to be repeated until it sounds ordinary, until it sounds distant, until the words 1,000 dead feels no heavier than the weather report. And that is the quiet danger. Not that truth disappears, but that we learned how to live beside it. So, when truth can no longer stop harm, something deeper has happened. The problem is no longer ignorance. The problem is no longer secrecy. The problem is exhaustion. We know, we see, we hear, and yet harm continues, which raises a question far more unsettling than the one we started with. If truth is visible, if truth is documented, if truth is spoken across every platform in every nation, then why does harm continue? And more importantly, who benefits when it does? Because when a society becomes comfortable living beside truth instead of acting on it, someone, somewhere, is profiting from that silence. And that is the question we will ask in the next episode. This has been Who Yelling Now. See you in the next episode.